Hi everyone, we'll just give it a couple of minutes for everyone to join and then we'll be kicking off the conversation. You are in the right place. Please do just hang on and we'll be with you shortly. Okay, perfect. Hi everyone, welcome to the latest Reuters Events Pharma webinar, Embed Patient Value as Your Access Differentiator. Really excited for this conversation today. We're going to be having a fantastic panel discussion. Throughout this, please do send in your questions through the Q&A function below. This means that when we get to the Q&A section at the end of the session, our panelists will do their best to answer all the sort of intricacies of any questions you've got on what they've said so far. Before we go over to that, I just want to say that this has been created in the lead up to Pharma EU or Pharma Europe, which is the new iteration of I for Pharma Barcelona, which I'm sure most of you have come across before. You're probably very bored of seeing my emails already, but please do after this take a look at the agenda. Some of our speakers from today will be involved with us at the event, and you'll probably have a chance to network with all of them at the event anyway. So please do take a look, and if you've got any questions about that or about webinars or being involved with us in any way going forward, please do shoot me over an email to the one that I've been emailing you on all the time. So without any further ado, I'm going to pass over to our chair for the day. Hugh is from Novo Nordisk, and he's going to kick off the conversation with the rest of our panel. So over to you, Hugh.
Thanks, Saskia, and good afternoon, everyone. So just to introduce myself, my name is Hugh Thomas, and I'm the National Market and Patient Access Manager for Novo Nordisk and the Biopharm division based out of the UK. And I'm the humbled individual who's been given the honour to chair the webinar today. So one of the reasons why I'm proud to work for Novo Nordisk is our focus on patients living with diabetes, obesity, and rare diseases. And we really work hard to understand what the impact of living with chronic conditions has on health, daily life, work, family relationships, and emotional well-being. But something that's critical, and it's the focus of the panel discussion today, is how we can encapsulate the voices of the patients that we serve and critically embed their values as access differentiators. So what I'd like to do is introduce our panel and ask our panel, Claire, Thomas, Jennifer, and Pete, all to introduce themselves and briefly tell us what's drawn us or drawn you to taking part as part of the panel today.
So hi everybody, my name is Claire Haig. I work as the Head of Market Access at Janssen, covering the haematology business. And the reason why I was so excited to join the panel today and to participate in this webinar is just, I guess you can't underestimate, and none of us can, the value of the patient perspective. And my particular interest is in how we embed that patient perspective into the health technology appraisal process, but importantly, how we convey the information that we are presenting on our products in a way using language that patient advocates and the patient community and carers can understand. So thank you very much for this opportunity, and I'm super excited to be here.
Claire. Thomas.
Hi everyone, Thomas Aßmann. I'm the VP Market Access in Kyowa Kirin for the Rare Disease Business Unit, responsible for the EMEA and CEE region. Equally excited to be here. It is a very relevant topic since involvement in patients and patient insights gathering is increasingly becoming important. We do it, for instance, already before we finalize our pivotal phase 3 clinical trials, talking to patients to make sure we capture the relevant endpoints from their perspective. And also from an HTA standpoint, in some of the jurisdictions in Europe, patient-relevant outcomes are the ones that make the mark for positive or a non-benefit or negative assessment. And so it is a very relevant topic. Thank you very much, and very glad to be here.
Thanks, Thomas. We go to Jennifer next.
Thanks, Hugh, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm so excited to be a part of this panel to talk about the future of patient engagement throughout the entire pharmaceutical life cycle. The role that I have right now is I'm on the executive board of the Medicines for Malaria venture, where we specialize in malaria as a neglected disease. And I have come from other leadership roles in access, where I've been the vice president, global head of patient access at Sobi, a rare disease company, and having led region Europe for Roche and having been a director in Novartis in emerging markets. Before all this, I actually was with the World Health Organization. So this is a great passion that I bring to this panel of having engaged with patients in different sectors, as well as different phases of the product life cycle that we have in our industry. And I'm just really excited to be a part of this dialogue and to hopefully transform the way that we embed our patient interactions by putting patients at the center of our dialogue in all that we do in pharma. Thanks, Hugh.
Thanks, Jennifer. And lastly, Pete.
Yeah, thank you, Pete van der Wal. Welcome everybody this afternoon. I work with Takeda in the market access department in the Netherlands, and I'm really excited to join this conversation because we are currently in a, I think, very innovative and unique procedure for an orphan drug, where the role of the patient organization is central, and that's, I think, the future, especially for drugs that have difficulty building all the clinical evidence with large-scale studies, so orphan drugs. We need shared responsibility to make a decision on reimbursement, and patients as the client and also the payer of the price eventually are critical and important in this role, and I think they can really play this role very well. So I look forward to telling you something more about our experiences in this project and to the whole discussion. Thank you.
That's great. Well, thank you all for your introductions, and I'll just reiterate Saskia's point at the start. I will try to aim to have some time for questions at the end. So anybody in the audience, please make sure that you do use the question Q&A function to put some questions in that I can ask to the panel. So if we get into our discussion then, and I think we can kick off really. From my perspective, I'd love to gain some of your insights into where and how you see the regulatory bodies sort of shifting a little and starting to view patient engagement more in terms of, in the sense of the patient perspective, and how can we essentially as an industry start to use the patient perspective with regards to our HTA submissions to help.
Yeah, maybe I can start off by making a comparison with other fields than only medicine, where you see similar movements in the context of very innovative developments, innovative technologies, very specialized, for example, artificial intelligence, things that are used in autonomous cars, for example, where regulatory bodies naturally lack knowledge about all these new innovations, and they are going so fast that it's difficult for regulatory bodies to, on their own, make decisions on, do we give access to these innovations? Do we not do it? Do we pay for it? And that's where the role of the experts comes in play, and it's critical. I mean, you need to know what's exactly happening in all these novel, in our case, treatments in very rare diseases, which are often complex, have heterogeneous populations. And then, of course, patients are the best experienced partners in this area to share the responsibility for the correct and adequate use of these medications. I mean, if patients have to take medication or have to take an injection, they will not do that just because they like to take some expensive medication. They are very well aware that they have to also be responsible in using the medication or rejecting it. So I think it's a natural development in the context of the upcoming orphan drugs developments, but also gene therapy. And it's a very suitable and yeah, also pragmatic approach to the problem of reimbursement.
Pete, I really like how you spoke about the role of artificial intelligence as a kind of example of the risk profile that we see with our regulators, I think globally. And I think we see a real departure in how, for example, the US FDA and the EMA have looked at the risk profile and the ability to speed access to those type of like healthcare interventions in AI with achieving rapid, so for example, in the FDA, achieving rapid access with acquisition of data as we progress. Whereas in the EMA, we've been far more conservative. And I think that is really a close analog to how we're looking at, you mentioned rare diseases, I think very much rare diseases, where in the US FDA, we see that their risk profile is far different from the EMA perspective, where the US FDA is willing to take on phase 2 data, especially in rare disease populations where we have small populations of patients. We're able to actually engage patient organizations to really speak about the concrete unmet need. Whereas in Europe, we have seen in the last 12 months, molecules that don't get approved actually in Europe with the same data file, with the same patient data, with the same composition in Europe, where we do have accelerated access in the US. And I think what's a challenge there is we're only talking right now about the marketing authorization. We're not even talking about the payer full patient access yet. But already when the first step towards patient access is already compromised because of the difference in interpretation of risk profile and how that patients are or are not listened to in those forums, I think we already have a significant challenge, and it's a call for change and regulatory reform because our regulators are lagging behind our significant unmet need that we have with our patients.
That's interesting what you say. In our organization, we have a drug, we are dedicated to rare diseases, but we also have a condition in neurology. And we did have conversations with the regulators, and they accepted our patient surveys that we concluded and conducted together with KOLs in part and included in the regulatory submission. So there is a move, as you say, maybe slowly from the US, also in Europe, the CHMP and the regulators accepting these data. And then from an HTA perspective, particularly Germany and France, with comparative effectiveness, right, patient-relevant outcomes are the ones that are required for the assessment.
I think you raised some very interesting points there. And I think that this dilemma, this gulf between the FDA and EMAs is an interesting one. And the gulf, as you say, between the regulators and the HTA agencies is like monumentous. But I think starting with the regulators, I do think that we need to acknowledge that they are making steps forward. So for the PRIME designation, the early scientific advice, they are very open to engaging early and finding, accelerated means to provide input and advice. One of the other things that also gives me a glimmer of hope is that I'm liking the fact that I'm seeing some evidence where patient preference studies are now being highlighted through the regulatory pathway for CAR T therapies as well, cell and gene therapies, being open to incorporating evidence of patient interviews, qualitative data, not just through, formal patient-reported outcome measures that may be quite outdated and aren't picking up that kind of unique risk-benefit profile. So I think that we need to sort of give some credit to the regulators. But I do think that as manufacturers, the onus is on us to work in partnership with patients and patient advocacy groups to generate this evidence, because it won't be generated by itself. So I think, irrespective of whether it's welcome or not, I think we should still really invest heavily, test new ways, as you said, Jennifer, artificial intelligence, devices, anything that can describe how a patient feels and the difference, positive or negative, a new treatment can make to their quality of life, and also picking up that burden of treatment, that horrible kind of what they're living with, which is really hard to pick up in a trial, just through normal efficacy measurements. So I think the message for me would be, I think we need to acknowledge that progress is being made. Whether it's sufficient, maybe more can be done. But I think as manufacturers, we can keep pushing and keep investing in that evidence, partnering with those patients and carers as well, and the advocates, of course.
Claire, these are great points. I'm so glad that you raised them. I think patient-centric evidence is really critical here. And although the original question that Hugh asked us was about the regulatory step, if I even take it a step earlier and we're talking about the development process of how, as an industry, how seriously are we taking this conversation with patients at the development design stage by really having them there as a partner, not as a consultant. And I think that's really a much needed mindset shift first and foremost. And from that mindset shift will follow additional steps that we have in those development process, where even at the screening of those molecules, even at the clinical trial design phase, do we have the right endpoints? Do we have the right secondary endpoints? Do we have the right PRO measures in place? Is the trial designed in a way that the patients will actually be excited to be a part of? Or is there some type of design element that we have included that actually halts enrollment or slows enrollment down? So I think actually having those conversations as we design, and that allows us to have a different data package, a different molecule as well, a different potential regulatory filing and a value-based payer filing, but really a different molecule. And our clinical trial process will also look quite different if we're able to design something that's actually more patient-friendly in the actual execution of the trial.
Definitely. And I think, Jennifer, I'd even go a step further back to say, are we interviewing patients at the disease area strategy to say, what are your unmet needs and what treatment should we develop to meet those needs, even before we get to identifying the molecule? Because if we were making cars or making any kind of object to offer to anybody, we would be interviewing people. We'd be saying, what do you want from our new car? What does it look like? How fast does it go? We wouldn't be developing cars without trying to figure out what people want. And yet with new medicines, we're getting the message, right? But I think as an industry, we really need to start to think about patients before, we're in the trial.
Totally, yeah. I totally agree as well. And patient insights early, absolutely critical. But in addition, I think we need to be taking a very holistic approach, which is also talking to the payers early, or to ex-payers at least, to get their perspective, learn from them, and we learn from them as well, so that they don't get a surprise when we come to the submissions of our dossiers for reimbursement. We have to educate them a lot earlier and make them understand, and together with key opinion leader support as well. But getting the patient voice early is absolutely, it is crucial, and regulators are, that's at least my experience, are getting more receptive to this as well, and are willing to review even the data as part of oral hearings, oral explanations, or as part of the initial data package review. So we are moving in, I think we are moving in the right direction. Our job is to also educate internally our clinical colleagues that regulatory endpoint alone and the classical endpoints alone will no longer be sufficient as we develop new drugs, be it in rare diseases or be it outside of rare diseases.
Yeah, and maybe to add to that, I think especially in rare diseases where the voice of the patient is important because clinical data are limited, we need to early on incorporate patient information, from factors like participation at work, care consumption, individual changes in quality of life, not comparing one group with the other, but comparing the patient with him or herself. Those are different endpoints that we normally use in clinical trials, and they are important in the discussion when it comes to rare diseases, where you have to resort to different endpoints.
And I love, Pete, how you touched on, the impact of carers, the impact of patients and society as a result of productivity. And it doesn't have to be paid work, it can be leisure work, it can be anything. But valuing that time is something that we don't routinely do in all our submissions. But wouldn't it be wonderful to have that much broader perspective than just looking at hospital drug costs, for example? So there's a great opportunity there, and how we do that, obviously measuring those kind of the productivity changes, is not how we get there is uncertain, but it's not a barrier to try. And I'm sure there's loads of questionnaires that we could start to explore to better understand that, because I think we've seen with COVID, it's a good example of where it's much bigger than just a time in hospital. Just the long COVID and the impact on patients it's a really nice example. That actually might help educate our payers and regulators to understand that diseases are not just very narrow, that they have wider impact on society.
Yeah, but I think also, at the end of the day, the devil is in the detail, right? At the moment, at least, we still live in Europe, in a world where we have different jurisdictions that recognize direct or indirect costs or both. And so we have to be careful about just generalizing too much. It has to be really a very holistic approach by looking into the opportunities market by market, and then trying to find a common ground, and also the specificities that are required for optimal market access and reimbursement as well.
So we've just been touching on quite a few points there. What I picked out a few elements, so I'd just like to steer the flow of the discussion slightly. So in terms of the patient voice being incorporated really early on from that development point, I think being incorporated right the way through to the payers, how can we evolve essentially how we work with patient groups and organizations really early on to provide more valued feedback back to the groups, but also that we can also take their voice and really incorporate it through as was discussed? And do you have any specific examples of how you're changing the way that you're already and evolving the way you're working with societies and groups?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. And I think that if you can imagine, if every pharmaceutical company decided to engage with a patient advocacy group on every single trial and every single indication, what you will identify, which is the key issue, is capacity within the patient community to do what we all say we want to do. So capacity is number one, and also capability. So how can we partner to make sure that our advocates also have the skills and capabilities needed in order to give that input? And most of them will have, of course, but you would need to upscale significantly. But that's, again, not a reason not to do it. It's just a case of how can we do it? Because, I mean, at Janssen or any company, we've all got great examples of where we've done things well, but can we honestly say that we've done it across every single program on every single product? I doubt we could say that. And some of it is due to timing and internal factors, but sometimes it could be a capacity issue as well. And I'd really like to try and understand how collectively, and I'm talking about from a regulatory HTA industry and patient advocacy community, how we can grow that capacity at the local PAG level in order to do this, because otherwise we're just going to have really nice examples, but no consistency across the industry.
I think, Claire, you touch on one piece, which is the PAG, the patient organizations. I think one of the questions that maybe some of the people who are listening to is, whom do I reach out to? Like, what type of patient professional patient, patient organization, or actual patient or caregiver or parent are looking for. It very much just is determined by, what phase of the life cycle are you in? What geography are you looking at? This is your global portfolio strategy, as you referenced earlier, Claire, or is this your go-to-market strategy? Then it's the more local you'll need to be based on the type of question that you're trying to solve for. I think another thing is, thinking about the how, like concrete examples. I'm really grateful for the European Commission for actually putting in place some of these initiatives and incentive programs for not only the industry, but also for patient organizations to actually raise up their hand and to ask for funding, to have truly patient organization-led initiatives. The initiative of the AKU Society in the UK, which effectively serves the globe, they partnered together with the University of Liverpool and the European Commission and the manufacturer to actually run a clinical trial that would not have been run because the molecule was at the end of its life cycle. So I think those kinds of incentives being put in place by either DG Research, DG Innovation, or Sante can help us actually facilitate some of these dialogues. I think we all acknowledge none of us are going to be able to do this alone. This isn't a pharma only or manufacturer only initiative. This isn't a public instrument initiative. This is something that the patients can't do themselves, but only in partnership. Just as we've observed with COVID rapid research and development, it's the same kind of thing when we look at patient-driven research.
Yeah, exactly. So it is it's public affairs, it's governmental affairs, it's liaisons with experts in the medical field. And well, the experience with our project in the Netherlands for conditional reimbursement for an orphan drug is that patient organizations are very willing, but exactly they don't have the capacity, and some do. Some organizations are only 2 patients in the board. Yeah, of course they need support, but the question is, can we give them that support, or are we too much biased? And the answer is yes, of course. So they need to get support from elsewhere. I would think, and that's what we have experienced, is by just linking those patient organizations with the clinical experts is already helpful, and yeah, it teaches them their role, what they can say, how they should phrase it, all that sort of, well, maybe very basic experience. And
yeah, I think I like the point that Claire mentioned regarding capacity. It is that's really a very important topic. The other topic is timing. As we formulate our disease area strategies, right? When we talk about certain diseases, we can't, of course, at that stage talk about a certain molecule, right? We can only talk about the brand after the registration, but we can talk about a condition, a medical condition, and we can talk about how we think we would approach the development of this drug and the endpoints we would be measuring and looking at. And getting early feedback on that would be great. But again, the challenge in some countries really is capacity. Like UK certainly is great for that, other major markets as well, but in smaller markets, that's also a challenge. So point well taken.
Yeah, the good thing is that we were in our project in the situation that we were forced by the HTA authorities to liaise with experts and patient organizations. They made us talk to them. So that puts us in a completely different position and yeah, prevents the normal hiccups that you have when trying to talk to patients. So this is also part of the public affairs, maybe activities that we need to employ to change the way governments and HTA authorities review new medications and how they facilitate the inputs from patients. Yeah, taking into account the fact that there are not many patient organizations that are currently able to do this. Yeah. So they need support. They need also to facilitate interaction between experts and patient organizations, but also with the industry.
Yeah.
Because we are not only bad, we also have knowledge and experience, and we can also on a decent level of talk with patients, of course.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah.
Decent boundaries. Yeah.
I think, Pete, you make a good point about, perhaps there's a call to the EU Commission for centralised funding for patient advocates to specifically upskill and grow as they input into regulatory and HTA systems and processes, because that would solve the problem of this conflict of interest that exists between manufacturers and patient advocates, where, we should pay them and reimburse them for their time, but in so doing, there is a perceived level of compromise there. And so that could be a good way forward. But I think as we stand today, without that central funding and investment to those organisations, I think we're going to be where we are, just quite fragmented. I think if I was working as a patient advocate, I would feel frustrated as well, because I would want to do all these activities and I wouldn't have the capacity to do it. So I think perhaps that's something to reflect on.
So Claire, on that point, I've received a very interesting question in the chat. So thank you, Paul Corness, for this really great question, talking about minimum, what we're going to define as minimum clinical benefit that's defined by patients as a patient minimum clinical benefit. And I think what you've just talked about, Claire, is could we create incentives that would be coming from the commission, or maybe it's DG Innovation, because that's actually this case I was talking about with the AKU Society driving that development program, actually was funded by DG Innovation and the commission. So this idea, and I really like this, Paul, this concept of finding a way to work with other patient groups to define what is that minimal clinical benefit that will allow us to design a phase 2 and a 3 that could enable us to stop a trial that's not on target to meet the standards. I'm just reading the question. To save the investment, again, so that we can reinvest into something that's actually going to have a clinical benefit. It's a really interesting question. And I think that's something that we could experiment. Like, let's find a way to find different organizations. I know, for example, the European Brain Council is one of those organizations that's consolidated multiple patient organizations around neurology instead of having individual ones. From a rare disease perspective, Reuters has done this. So if we're talking about if Paul, if you're thinking specifically about a rare disease condition, this is a question that you could take to Reuters, because they consolidate all rare disease conditions and they lobby at the commission on behalf of all of those conditions together. They also do the training and the advocacy work as well for those individual patient organizations. But I think this is a great thing. Also, if you're working already with UPATI is really one of the kind of godmothers of how to map out what that value chain looks like and how patients can get involved in every phase of the molecule life cycle. I think that's where you work together with that framework to identify where can you have a voice, what voice at what point, and what can you influence in the development, in the regulatory, or in patient access, or maintaining and growing access. And then what's the channel that you would use to do that influence from a regulatory policy perspective? I think, again, if it's a rare disease perspective, then Reuters is the place to go. But it looks like ESMO, I think this might have been an oncological question. So ESMO also has that as a resource. But thanks for the question. It was a great question, Paul.
Yeah, and I think just to add a little bit on the end of that is that I think what Paul's talking about is, what we tend to develop in the industry is what we call target product profiles, which is what we craft before we go into the clinical trial setting, defining what good looks like. And we do it from a regulatory, from a payer. But I think what Paul's saying is make it patient focused too, so that we're getting that difference between treatment arms, which is what we expect to be patient meaningful. And as an industry, we've had quite some challenges getting the organizations we work in to shift from that regulatory focus to the payer focus. And now I think the next challenge is let's push our organizations further to validate those target product profiles with patients. And then, okay, I think what the beauty of that is that then all of the detail of the protocols already is de-risked before you then would reach out for further input. So I really like the thinking there, and I think it could be something that I don't see any huge problems in trying to do.
So I totally agree, Claire. We can certainly, as we develop early TPP, involve patient input into that. And as we design our pivotal trial protocols, we should do it as well. We should not only talk to KOLs, we have to talk to payers to make sure we have the payer-relevant endpoints included, but patient-relevant endpoints may be captured as well, may be possible to be captured as well. Like, for instance, in MS, right? No one has ever looked into fatigue as an endpoint, but it is a symptom that bothers patients so much. And if you listen to patients in that condition, they say, I just feel like I can sleep and lay down the whole day. And it is a significant issue. So if a drug has some potential of in an indirect pathway, maybe to address this, it would be really, really incredibly valuable for patients. Just as an example.
Just before we move on, actually, there was another question whilst we talking about patient groups and that was from Dawn with regards to centralized funding. Does it need more than centralized funding for PAGs? I'll read the question, but actually alignment across PAGs for training. There are a lot of training initiatives at an individual PAG level, but that could be better shared and used more broadly. I think that's a really valid comment there. And any follow up on that?
It makes perfect sense. Certainly, I think, as you said, it's not just money. It's people, it's leveraging resources, and what is needed thus to enable such sharing to take place. And is it genuine? Is it generic across all diseases, or is it disease agnostic or dependent? But it's a great point, and I definitely think that, yeah, money could be a key enabler, but there'll be other factors as well to consider.
Resources, definitely. In terms of manpower, in addition to money, yeah.
Okay, so I think that probably covers us nicely on patient groups. One thing I picked out actually, Pete, was earlier on you were mentioning AI, and I think that brings me on to the fact that HTA bodies and industry, we both have joint and common goals in bringing the most innovative products and innovation in itself directly to patients. And we've got, particularly through COVID, we've seen an acceleration of digital and access to technology. So we've got a whole arsenal at our fingertips now. So how can we really start to incorporate digital solutions such as patient companion apps and telemedicine into our submissions?
Yeah, one of the challenges we have is to collect alternative endpoint data, not lab data or measurements that you can do with some device, but information on how patients behave, how they see the doctor or don't see the doctor, how they perform at work, and all that sort of information is to be collected at the level of the individual patient, just by asking. And that's what I specifically like about the digital approach. Your smartphone is the closest you can get to a patient. It's in his pocket. He can respond to it at any time of the day. And if you design clever software, then you can collect incredibly important information that you otherwise do not have. And in the context of lack of clinical evidence and looking for more pragmatic real-world evidence in an individual patient, that is the way to go, I would say. And we are missing it at the moment.
I think COVID really provided a huge watershed moment for all that is telemedicine, for all that is potentially AI, AI in the form of machine learning and managing big data that comes in from telemedicine. So traditionally, when we spoke of real world evidence in the past, we would speak of a defined population with a couple of data points. Now, when we have these, sensing devices, quantified self kind of devices, I'm wearing my Oura ring, which tracks everything for me. there are thousands, millions of data points that are captured on each individual patient or each individual citizen or potential patient. So I think, COVID really allowed us to, if we took advantage of it, to really embrace our patients and understand how do we help them solve the physical barriers that were happening as a result of physical access being blocked from care centers. So that really truly embracing this concept that healthcare can be geographically agnostic, and that healthcare could be both the monitoring as well as the feedback loops, and even some of the care through through the sensors, through the AI machine learning of that produces the insights, and that opens a door for future AR, VR that we'll have in healthcare, where we really will be truly patient-centric, because the care will happen where the patients are. So I think we're in this moment where the great disruption we've just had in 2020 to 2021 has allowed us, and hopefully all of us were experimenting with that and putting the patients at the center of those design principles as we design telemedicine for them, to then come up with our future solutions of how we're going to solve these future gaps in physical access.
Yeah, exactly.
I think we are just at the start of the journey, Jennifer, right?
Sorry, Thomas, go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to say, I think we are just at the start of the journey in all of this, because when I think back in my previous organization, when we started thinking about telemedicine devices to collect certain patient data, how bothersome they were and how complicated they were to use and to implement and to instrument them. So, but now, as Jennifer says, all this with this AI, the apps that are existing for multiple apps that exist for various conditions, for almost every disease, that allows us to become a lot more patient-centric and identify the things, the points, the endpoints, and that really patients consider clinically meaningful, not only regulators and payers. And that's where we have to learn and then convince our other customers that they also accept these as relevant in their assessments.
In the context of the use of digital devices and software, I was surprised by the fact that even patients with melanoma, which is for everybody a well-known deadly disease, treatment compliance on the longer term, for example, after 1 year, is only 50%. So treatment compliance also, especially when you have an expensive drug, from the payer's perspective, is an important factor in assessing the value of the treatment or the cost effectiveness of the treatment. And I think digital could really help us be very close to the patient, educate the patient, ask for feedback on a regular basis, give feedback to the patient again, in order to keep them, how do you say, involved, and by doing so, being more treatment compliant, and having a better guarantee of return on investment.
I think we can also do a lot better subgroup analysis in the communication with our payers, to say we are not asking you for reimbursement in the whole of the population. This is the subpopulation that does respond, and the value for money is really in that population. So we have to be a lot more smart about that as well, and recognizing that the payers will look at minimizing their impact, their budget impact, in every shape or form. So if we have that compelling data, it helps us a lot in the negotiations as well down the road.
I mean, I'm excited, Peter and Thomas, Jennifer, by technology, digital AI. It all sounds really cool. I'd also like for us to to think about how do we engage the patients and the advocates in how we navigate this technology, because there will be some patients, that won't have iPhones, they won't want to wear a device, they'll have reservations about it. Even, we've heard people saying that vaccines are a computer chip. Like people sometimes don't understand, what we're talking about here. So it would be really great to try and better understand who our patient populations are, what's going to work for them, particularly the elderly patients that just might not be as engaged in this, and how do we work with different types of patients to get them to experiment perhaps with different ways of collecting data, because we're kind of going from, you know, almost like old-fashioned paper questionnaires, really, you know, PRO, just old school, to then, you know, talking about something that could be really out there. Yeah. Even, you know, I've heard about technology that can even analyze people's faces in telemedicine and take their heartbeat and all kinds of stuff. And you think, wow, that's amazing. But working with patients and carers and really just trying to understand what's their tolerance and interest in technology, and what could we work with, and what, in fact, we probably need lots of different options, I guess, to accommodate different people, because we don't want to exclude people that just don't like, you know, having a tracker on them, for example. So, but it's a great, exciting challenge.
No, you know, you mentioned a very good point which we haven't touched upon so far, which is for certain conditions, the caregiver really plays a very important role, right? If you think of Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's disease, and many oncological conditions, the caregiver plays an important role as well. So we have to listen to them as well. Absolutely.
Right. So, and I think you're making a really good point there, Claire, around, you know, how do we really not isolate certain groups of patients. So I think it is a case of potentially not running, but certainly walking before we can run, and you know, merging how, you know, potentially being able to incorporate digital with our current methods, but rather than going holistically all digital in terms of how we gather things. But see, we've just got another comment come in here in terms of agreeing. So I find in my work it's important. Oh, that's disappeared actually, that question. Have you answered it by any chance, Jennifer? Yeah. So just for everyone.
Sorry, I typed it and I didn't know that wasn't visible. I'm sorry. So the benefit of everyone, the answer I wrote was the role of digital. So Diane was speaking about, you know, how that they were doing similar work during COVID, where they were doing digital surveys. And I think that's really interesting, because in the past, when we're used to doing focus groups or maybe even face-to-face ethnography with our patient groups, you know, this, again, the COVID period gave us the opportunity where we can actually hit a larger scale of patients if we're doing digital ethnography. And usually that means that there's some kind of sensor or tracker or some kind of app-enabled thing that we're using, or even if it's, you know, voice recognition AI that we could use that actually helps us with digital ethnography. It allows us to get larger scale, to understand those trends, and generally like where patients are on the spectrum of what we're trying to understand of their value, what they're valuing, and helps us design something more effective that's listening to them and having them drive.
Great. Thank you for thanks for bringing that question back and answering it. So yeah, so I think you know, a lot of good discussion here. One other thing that was mentioned earlier before was that big gulf between the FDA and the EMA, and you know, whilst we still have some time, particularly I'm quite interested in what your opinions are and how we can help, you know, through all of what we've discussed, bridge that gap and that gulf.
Yeah, first of all, by showing how it can be done, by showing success. And in that respect, I'm very enthusiastic about the project I'm involved in with the Dutch authorities and the conditional reimbursement. If we can bring that to a good end, then that's a first proof of concept, maybe for a very nice blueprint for future access for orphan drugs in a different approach than only evidence-based medicine. And maybe it's not only for orphan drugs, but also for the more normal population drug development, that we need to look further than evidence-based medicine only, by measuring lab data and all that sort of dry information on patients. It's maybe not what patients only consist of. No? Yeah, so if we can show that that such an approach where we go more pragmatic, where we ask patients input, where we ask patients' response to how they experience the drug, if that is successful in outlining which subgroups of patients should have access, how it should be followed up, how it can be cost effectively implemented in the country, and yeah, that is, I think, evidence that nobody can neglect them.
I think an interesting question also that gets asked sometimes of manufacturers is, what's the value in capturing all of this patient evidence? What difference is it really making, right, to patients or to decision-making bodies like regulators and HTA agencies? And one of the things that we've identified, and this won't be rocket science to anybody on the line, but that there is significant variation across different countries in the voice of the patient in HTA decision-making. So which countries will accept evidence from patients, which it's more of a tick box, there's examples of agencies that are really inclusive and accommodating of patients, and, you know, bringing them into committees and having a voice there. And one of the things that's recently happened under the auspices of the HTAI International Organization is they've been working on a pilot project. It's called the Summary of Information for Patients, where manufacturers submit information in a template to all HTA agencies, because it's an international template, on the information on their products and the disease in layperson's terms, so that patient advocates can understand it and also use that information to compile their own submissions to HTA agencies. So I think that's a really important step forward that I wanted to flag on the panel, because before this initiative from HTAI, there was real fragmentation across Europe, and, you know, as a manufacturer, we're not able to share information directly to patients or patient advocates on our products, or the, you know, and in some countries we can talk about the disease, but not on our products. So this enabler from HTAI should really help patient advocates play a more prominent role, and then in turn should help manufacturers secure necessary investment to carry on the good work, right? In investing in capturing patient relevant evidence, we in turn can help patients play a greater voice in decision making, not only with the HTA agencies, but with the regulators. So I, you know, really commend HTAI for this initiative. I think it's brilliant. And I'm really excited to see how it's being rolled out as well. We're doing a pilot with NICE at the moment, but I'm very keen to know how GBA and other agencies that maybe haven't been quite so interested in patient preference studies, interviews, you know, the non-traditional evidence, how they will flex and accommodate this initiative. So just wanted to flag that, because I do think that, you know, that's a significant opportunity for us to make some progress here.
Yeah, and speaks to the point that patient advocacy is not a global thing, it's not a regional thing. Patient advocacy at the moment at least still happens in the market. And as you say, different HTA bodies have a different approach, and my experience is exactly the same, that NICE along the way, also while you are reviewing the drug is under review, under HTA review, is more open to listen to what patients have to say, and Germany and France have a different perspective. And
it's unacceptable, and it's unacceptable because...
And it is, I totally agree. It is,
same, right?
Yeah, they are unacceptable, but it goes back to the point I made earlier. We have, unfortunately, not a harmonized Europe when it comes to HTA. We have a harmonized Europe for regulatory purposes, and we get a regulatory European-wide, you know, summary of product characteristics. But then it diverges, and it is, I totally agree with you, it is in a way unacceptable, and it doesn't allow for the recognition of an unmet medical need that exists for certain conditions And these conditions and the unmet medical need is not defined by a certain HTA body. It is defined by the problems and the suffering by the patients.
I agree.
So Thomas, I have a question for you because, now that the Portuguese presidency, not the Portuguese pregnancy, but the Portuguese presidency has just ended. And one of the last push that they had really was getting this HTA legislation off the ground. And again, that's years and years, 15, 17, 20 years of work that's culminated in this legislation. Do you think by having the core HTA elements of the core HTA dossier as something that could be exchangeable across markets, do you think that's going to be more patient friendly and it's going to allow us to speed access for our patients?
So that's a great question, Jennifer. And there is an ongoing review at the moment in Brussels, right? There's an ongoing review currently in Brussels about a potential harmonization of the European access review. So a European, harmonized EU dossier. I think we are still far away from that because the GDPs are defining, right, in a way, our drug pricing that we can get and the way drugs are assessed in certainly big markets like Germany and France would certainly be not very much excited and willing to change suddenly their way of assessing a new modality. So that's, I think, one of the reasons why we still are a long way away from a more harmonized approach.
And thinking about ways that we can, we've talked about the role of patients in evidence generation, collaboratively with manufacturers, in order to harness that ultimately to achieve access. There are some countries that are using that type of real world evidence, co-created evidence with patients. The UK
Yes.
does a great job of that. France does a great job of that. I think the one really that we always keep pushing on is whether Germany will ever take real world evidence, right? Because that's something that's super needed for us to be able to demonstrate that patient unmet need, the burden of illness, et cetera.
I mean, in Germany, the dialogue just started in terms of real-world evidence, acceptance of data, but they made it very clear we will start looking at this at very rare conditions before we consider broader application in less or in non-orphan conditions. But it's starting, but again, very slowly.
So Pete, I know that you're based out of the Netherlands. I'm curious as well, because the Netherlands will sometimes create reimbursement opportunities, patient access and reimbursement opportunities for off-label indications based on what is spontaneously used. This is also very patient-friendly. This is another mechanism of speeding access to patients. What are your thoughts on that? And if other markets wanted to take that in as a potential new avenue for access, what would be the how-tos of how to shape your environment in that direction?
Yeah, that's an interesting topic because it's not only or not always the patient who benefits from that sort of freedom, so to speak, because it's very frequently purely financially driven, because the drug that is then used off-label is cheaper, maybe supported by the insurance company or by the perception of the doctor. So it's not per se a good solution. I think what should happen is that there is more of a voice from the experts on how to use these medications and why. Knowing that maybe the evidence is not all there, but they have experience or they have some insights in real world using it, and then they can translate that into a position statement, which can be used to position those drugs. I think that should be the way to go. And then of course that's from the doctor's perspective. If there's a good patient organization, they should also speak up and say, hey, you're prescribing our patients off-label because it's cheaper, but you should actually prescribe the drug that is better for us. And that is, it may be more expensive, but it is also better. And then of course there comes a challenge for us to show why better is more expensive. And I think then we come back to the discussion we had before. It's not only lab data and hard measure, it's also the patient perception and the effect on his participation in life and in work, which has actually a much larger financial benefit than the financial benefit in healthcare, because every hour that you don't work is a lot of money lost. Every 1 hour is a lot of money lost, and if you don't work optimally because you are not you're not treated optimally, then you lose not 1 hour, you lose many hours, and that's lots of money. So I think it's also a topic that we, maybe through patients should introduce in the whole discussion.
Which in Germany, unfortunately, would not be recognized because it would be indirect cost, and they don't consider this.
Yeah, the problem is always
that but it's essentially that's the case.
Yeah, it's paid from a different budget. So but that's a strange approach. From a patient perspective, at least, that's a strange approach.
Right.
I agree.
Believe it or not, this discussion has already been going on for an hour, and it's a brilliant conversation that we've been having, and it's been a great opportunity for us all to come together. But it's we knew this hour would fly by, but we certainly had some great insights into how we can incorporate the patient voice. I think very early on, even at that R&D sort of level, right the way through, how we can incorporate digital as well, how we can bridge the gap between different regulatory bodies, and ultimately also how we can work more collaboratively with our patient groups and organizations as well. If I just, before we close, just like to ask each member of the panel, if in the next couple of years, what's the biggest thing that you think will drive embedding that patient voice? If you could briefly give us your view and your perspective before I close off the discussion.
I think a pull from the HTA agencies will make a big difference.
I think the ubiquitous use and availability of 5G, which enables sensing technologies that are going to be very easy to use, which will allow us to have access to the data and communicate with patients, is going to drive all of this, because we'll be able to design with them based on their preferences, because we'll already know based on the sensing technologies that are out there.
Thanks, Jennifer.
I would say also the harmonization in terms of, or an approach towards more harmonization of HTA bodies and reviews, and the apply and the review systems and methodologies they apply, and then the increase in AI certainly as well.
Great. Thanks very much. Well, I'm sorry if we haven't been able to answer all of the questions. What I certainly like to do is to thank our organizers, Reuters Events, for hosting this webinar, certainly the panel. So Claire, Thomas, Pete, Jennifer, thank you so much for your contributions, and certainly giving your insights as well into how things are going to evolve. And lastly, we'd really like to thank our audience for dialing in and certainly asking some really thought-provoking questions over this last hour. That's really flown by. So thank you very much, everyone, and see you soon.
Thank you.